Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Brookings webinar, Ensuring Electoral Integrity at the State Level. My name is Elaine Kamarck. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings. And here at Brookings, we began work on state level elections 2 summers ago, when in the midst of the pandemic, states made a lot of changes in their voting rules in order to make it easier to vote in a pandemic. Voters responded, as we now know, in record numbers to these changes in 2020. But of course, in these polarized times, these changes also became fodder for vigorous inter-party fighting, suspicion, conspiracy theories, you name it. The changes that made it easier to vote during the pandemic have also been an ongoing source of controversy in the election world. I just want to remind everyone before I introduce our keynoter today that you can send questions to events@brookings.edu, or you can go to a hashtag election integrity and for tweet purposes. Our speaker today, our keynote speaker, we are very honored to have Katie Gibbs, Secretary of State for Arizona. Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State for Arizona. Secretary Hobbs has been in the center of this storm since the beginning. In 2020, Arizona was one of those states where a narrow Biden victory over Trump set off a storm of controversy and suspicion around the election, placing Hobbs front and center in the fight over election integrity. Hobbs became Secretary of State in 2019, following service in the Arizona legislature as a state rep, a state senator, and then as minority leader. Before that, she was a volunteer at her church, a social worker, and an executive at a domestic violence shelter. Hers has been a life of service, which she hopes and we hope will continue. She is currently leading in the race to be the Democratic nominee for governor of Arizona, and we wish her well. Katie, I want to move to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the experiences you've had since presiding over the 2020 election. It was, if I'm right, the first election you presided over, and what your life has been like ever since then.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Nobody who signed up to be Secretary of State anticipated what we would see in 2020. So I just have a few thoughts to share about that and what we're doing in Arizona to make sure that our elections are secure and that the public can trust in the integrity that's there. So we have early voting underway right now in Arizona for our primary election. And obviously election day, November, is right around the corner. So our office and our partners have been working around the clock to ensure that our elections continue to be both secure and accessible. And we accomplished this in 2020, despite many claims to the contrary, and we're doing so again this year. We learned a lot from the 2020 election. It was historic for several reasons. In Arizona, we had an extremely well-run election, and we saw historically high voter participation. There were more than 3.42 million ballots cast, and turnout was nearly 80%. This turnout in 2020 was a 23% increase from the 2018 midterm election and an 8% increase from the 2016 presidential election. Obviously, in the face of multiple challenges, I see that in and of itself as a huge accomplishment. Of those 3.42 million ballots cast, close to 90% of them were cast early. And I think this is strong evidence for the fact that not only does Arizona's ballot by mail system work, but voters have confidence in it. Arizona showed up for our democracy in 2020, and this is because Arizonans know that our elections are safe and secure. And we also did everything we could to ensure that voters didn't have to choose between their freedom to vote and their health and safety. Elections in the United States are conducted independently across thousands of jurisdictions. That independence, that decentralization in itself is a security feature. And this means that there's no single point of access. In Arizona, elections are conducted independently by each of our 15 counties and overseen by my office, the Secretary of State's office. We do several things to keep our elections secure, and I'm just going to go through a few examples, starting with the Arizona Voter Information Database, which is our voter registration database. It only allows access to state and county election officials, and all users are required to log in using a multi-factor authentication system. We also have several rigorous processes before elections, including our logic and accuracy testing. Counties conduct logic and accuracy testing on every piece of voting equipment to make sure that the ballots will be marked and counted correctly. And then in addition to that, our office performs a logic and accuracy test of a sample of voting and tabulation equipment at each county before each election. So this function happened at the end of June, beginning of July for this primary that we're in right now. A local reporter attended one of these LNA tests in one of our counties for the 2020 primary and really got a sense of how grueling the process can be. She described the test as thorough and mentioned how our office checks every minute detail. Our office has used the LNA testing process as an educational opportunity to help voters understand and really trust our processes. And we believe that maintaining a partnership between our office and our voters by allowing them to take part in and viewing what we do and educating them by answering questions that they have. It also includes ensuring that voters know their options for voting and helping them know where and how to get reliable information and directing them to who they can trust to provide it. Our office did this through a website, arizona.vote, and that's where we directed voters and are continuing to direct voters throughout the election process so they have all the information they need to participate and debunk a lot of the misinformation that's out there. We are expanding our efforts in voter education, hosting a series of town halls aimed at informing voters of upcoming election deadlines, new election laws, and how we're keeping our elections safe and secure. In this town hall series, we're working with Arizona's colleges and universities, other organizations and election partners. And this partnership aspect, building and growing these partnerships has been really critical to us in the successful execution of 3 elections in 2020 since the onset of COVID-19. And while a focus on building partnerships paid off in 2020, we still have more work to do. And we've continued to invest in collaboration, and it's been helpful to us in working to rebuild the public's trust in our democratic institutions leading up to the 2022 election and certainly beyond. One of the ways that we can protect the integrity of our elections and voting is to confront the doubt that some are purposefully sowing in our democratic institutions with accurate, timely, and credible information. That's certainly important now, not just for those working in the election space, but for everyday citizens who are frustrated by this and want to help debunk some of the misinformation. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. As Arizona Secretary of State, I have witnessed the lengths that election deniers will go to jeopardize our free and fair elections. Our state, as Elaine mentioned, was unfortunate to have the national coverage on the fraudulent audit of the 2020 election that was conducted in Maricopa County, despite the fact that the results were verified by members of both parties through all of the processes that we already have set up in statute, as well as certified by our governor and attorney general. County supervisors in Maricopa County received orange jumpsuits in the mail during this, as we call it, fraudit. Armed protesters were outside of my house yelling, "Katie, come out and play, we're watching you." As insidious as these actions were, we're now facing a better coordinated, increasingly complex, and more determined effort from those who seek to undermine our democracy. Our democracy is under siege at every level of government, and not just in Arizona, but across the country. Election deniers have been hard at work trying to restrict or deny the fundamental sacred freedom to vote. And we have conspiracy theorists and election deniers running for public office so that they can be in charge of administering future elections, not just here in Arizona, but in every state. These individuals are contributing one of the biggest threats to our elections, which is the campaign of misinformation and disinformation, primarily through social media. And the goal of this kind of campaign really is to undermine the public's faith in elections and democratic process overall. And we know that these efforts are underway and will continue throughout the next election cycle. Regardless of political ideology, this office and secretaries of states and election offices across the country should be led by someone who wants to provide equal access to the ballot and is more focused on the process and the integrity of the process than the outcome. Everyone can play a part in helping respond to mis and disinformation by ensuring that you're looking at and sharing articles from reputable sources and encouraging your friends and family to do the same. Also making sure that you're getting your election information from verified websites, like the one I mentioned, Arizona.vote, and from social media sources that are verified, those of election officials. And it's also really important to get up-to-date information directly from these election officials, whether it's through social media on their websites or directly contacting their offices. Our office has participated and is participating in the National Association of Secretaries of State Trusted Info 2022 campaign, which encourages voters to go directly to election officials' websites, verified social media pages to ensure that they're getting accurate information throughout the election cycle. This was an effort that we executed so well during 2020 that NAS leaders recognized our work at their most recent national conference. Our strategy is forward-facing. We're putting a lot of work into making sure that people can easily access credible information. Remember that democracy is on the ballot this year, and we must do all we can to ensure that we fight for everyday Arizonans and election officials across the country fighting for their voters as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Katie. That was a terrific summary, and you really have been in the eye of the storm there, I can say. You know, I can't emphasize how important it is, and I think later in the panel we'll talk a little bit more about this, just to educate people about how elections take place. I remember one of the first accusations made, the first conspiracies, was that China was sending ballots to Americans. And then and I said to someone, well, you know, got to step back and think about this. Ballots are printed by counties.
Yes.
There are more than 3,000 counties in the United States, and they use their own kind of paper. They have different format, etc. I suppose it would be possible for Chinese spies to go into every county of the United States and figure out what their ballot is, etc., etc. But you know, the whole thing there's so many ridiculous things, but people don't know how elections are normally done, and therefore the misinformation just spreads and spreads and spreads. What are the conspiracies that you think you've been able to fight back against most effectively?
Well, we certainly had our fair share of conspiracies related to injects of ballots into the system, and I want to touch on that for a minute, because there are so many layers of security in regard to every single aspect involved in elections and voting. And so ballots is one of those. And so even blank ballot paper at every county is kept in secure storage that has limited access, logged access, and access that only doesn't allow single point of access. So it has to be accessed by more than one person at a time. And so those are some things that we try to get out there to the public. Not everyone in the public is going to have time to go do a tour of all of the facilities to know this, but it's something that our office requires, if it's not in statutes, it's in the procedures manual. And that's true for ballots, the ballot paper, voted ballots, and equipment as well. There's a chain of custody for all of these things. So when they're not stored in the county facility because they're out being used at voting sites, there's chain of custody logs, and there's transportation logs to return those things back to the county offices, or in whatever jurisdiction, whatever those jurisdictional offices are. So certainly injects of ballots from China was one conspiracy. There was video that people took digging in dumpsters outside of the Maricopa County election office. Like, I don't know what they were thinking they were going to find or pretending they were going to find, but there was these accusations of ballots that were shredded, and went so far as to accuse a supervisor, the supervisor Clint Hickman, who is, his family farm is Hickman Family Farms, and they're an egg producer, probably the largest egg producer in Arizona. And they had a massive fire that destroyed hundreds of thousands of chickens. And there were accusations that was to cover up destruction of shredded ballots. I mean, it was so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And the Sharpie thing was kind of probably the first and loudest conspiracy. People were saying that they were given Sharpies at the voting polling locations to deliberately invalidate their ballots. And that's just not a thing that happens. When you vote on site on election day, your ballot is fed right into a tabulator. And if there's a problem with that ballot, the tabulator can't read it, you're immediately made aware of it, and the poll worker will help you fix that problem. The Sharpies don't invalidate ballots. The ballots are printed in an offset manner so that even if a mark on one side bleeds through to the other side, it doesn't affect the tabulation. And the Sharpies were actually the manufacturer's recommended marking device for a ballot that's going to be voted and then immediately fed into a tabulator, because it dries quickly and it doesn't gum up the systems. I can assure you that because of this controversy, nobody's using Sharpies at polling places this year.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many of these things that, which is why I think you're really leading the pack in educating voters. There's another thing you mentioned, which is the LNA, or logic and accuracy test. What's the logic stand for? Unpack that a little bit for the viewers.
Well, I mean, it's a technical term, and I don't actually know why we call them logic and accuracy tests, but that's what we've always called them. And so what happens is there's a ballot marking device. So, and these are primarily for the voters that need accessibility, because it's a computer that they feed a blank ballot into, and it can read them, the names, and walk them through touching the screen to vote, so that they can cast their ballot without assistance. And then it prints out the printed ballot. So those are tested to make sure that the scripts are correct, and that they're marking the ballots correctly. And then we test the tabulators as well. And so when we go out to every county, we have a predetermined script for all of these and the outcome. So we know what the outcome should be, and the test makes sure that the outcome matches. Most counties, so the counties do this on all of their equipment before we come out, and then we do it again with randomly selected pieces of equipment. And then after the election, the counties do it again to make sure that nothing changed between the pre-election test and the post-election test. I want to say that this is one of the areas that we try to be really transparent and make it open to the public. The counties can invite public to their logic and accuracy tests. They certainly invite them when we come out with our office, and then to the post election LNA tests. And the county parties Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, those are the parties we recognize in Arizona, can send representatives to these tests as well, to sign off on them and say, yes, I observed and I saw these results.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people don't even realize that in most states where there's absentee ballots, when those are opened, they're opened in a room guarded by police, and there's a Democrat and a Republican watching them.
Yeah. So, and I guess probably every state's mail-in ballot process is a little bit different, but in Arizona, we've had no excuse absentee voting since the 1990s. We did it before many of the states who have universal vote by mail adopted universal vote by mail. And so we've had a lot of time to really hone the processes and make sure that it is accurate and secure, and that as voting by mail has become more and more popular and the mode of voting that's used by the majority of voters, that the processes are to scale, rather than having a handful of voters who aren't going to be here on election day using absentee voting, to everybody who chooses to use this method as the accessible method for them. So, and so the chain of custody on ballots by mail would be the same as as I mentioned, once it's in the hands of election workers, either through collecting it at the secure ballot drop box or the polling site where it's dropped off by voters, or many of our counties have worked out arrangements with the Postal Service where instead of having it delivered by mail to the county officials will go pick it up at the postal center. And so the same chain of custody rules are in place. And once those signatures, which in most states the signature is the affidavit of your identity, is verified, then the ballot is separated from the envelope. That's important in terms of maintaining a secret ballot. Yeah, and then they're stacked and ready to tabulate as soon as that state's law allow tabulation to begin. And in Arizona, we're already tabulating ballots. Tabulation begins 14 days before election day in Arizona.
Which actually brings me to another interesting facet of this whole new world of elections, because, even though it's so controversial, and yet we forget that it all really started because there was a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Because people didn't want to go stand in a school gymnasium for 35 minutes next to somebody who might have COVID. I mean, it was very simple, it was no conspiracy in why we got there. And then people decided that they liked it. In Maryland, we just had a governor's primary for governor on both sides. And it took until Friday. So it took and really it's still not quite done. Mm-hmm. For the winner of the Democratic primary to be decided. And that's because they had this very antediluvian law that said they couldn't start counting absentee ballots until 2 days after the election. Right. So the problem with it is that, of course, you get one result on election night and then you get another result 4 days later. Now, in the Maryland case, it was the same person winning by approximately the same margin. So There's no suspicion, but you can see how it breeds suspicion. Is there any thought on best practices for counting, for sort of resolving this issue between the absentee ballot and the same day and the election day ballot?
Well, that certainly is one of the things that leading up to the election in 2020 that our office really tried to hammer home, especially with the media. Everybody wants election night, election day happens, polls close, everybody wants to know who won. And it is far more important to have an accurate count and to make sure that every valid ballot is able to be counted than to have a quick count, and understanding the public's desire for both, right? And so we really work to lay the expectations of, look, we're going to get this right. And that doesn't necessarily mean the results will be there on election night. And I think some of the things we've done in Arizona to get ahead of this, not just in what we're telling folks, is changing our laws, and so that we can start tabulating ballots early. The county elections offices are immediately verifying and processing those mail-in ballots as they receive them. So they're ready to be tabulated as soon as tabulation can start. As I said, we're already tabulating in Arizona. And, the results situation on election night versus post-election, I myself, my race in 2018 was called for my opponent on election night. I was 44,000 votes behind, but there were still enough outstanding ballots. And folks who follow the trends and know like where those outstanding ballots were, knew that enough of those ballots were probably coming from more Democratic areas that the race wasn't over, even though it had been called. And so, and an AP, your outlet called it. I know there's an AP reporter on here. But yeah, and and there was nothing nefarious about that. It was just the mechanics of how early voting works, who tends to use early voting, who tends to drop off their ballots later. And we knew that more Democratic ballots or Democratic leaning ballots tend to get dropped off later. And so they're going to be verified and tabulated after the fact rather than before the fact. And that's just how it works. I think the 2020 election kind of turned that on its head because more Republicans voted later and on election day in 2020. I think we're probably going to see that trend continue. But I think it's so important to just have those expectations that we're going to get it right. And we're going to make sure every valid vote is counted. And that's much more important than having it done tomorrow. And I just one more thing on the votes. This isn't necessarily a huge percentage of ballots. And as we work harder and do more to educate voters and give them the tools and resources, hopefully these aren't part of the process, but we have things built into our statutes where people can cast a provisional ballot. And they might need to, and also if they vote by mail and there's a problem with the signature verification, then they have a chance to cure that signature to verify, yes, this is my signature. I did cast this ballot. And so there's statutory timeframes that allow that to happen up to 5 days, 5 business days after the election for both a voter to cure their provisional ballot or to cure their signature on their mail-in ballot. And so that automatically is going to delay the ability to tabulate those ballots.
It's so interesting because, of course, this, like everything else in our society these days, this has become politicized. So you're absolutely right. So now the Republican vote happens on election night, and the Democratic vote tends to happen absentee or early ballot, et cetera. And there you are. In a conversation with a reporter about this, I made your point about, look, it's the most important thing in democracy is to, have the election reported honestly and accurately. And his response was, yeah, but what about us pundits?
Yeah.
One final question is, what in all of the work that you and your colleagues around the country have been doing to try and, add transparency to elections and fight back against this conspiracy theories, what federal intervention could help, if any? Okay. There's a lot of stuff in Congress. There was a great big bill, HR 1, which seems to have pretty much died. But if you could have one or two things out of the federal government, what would they be?
Well, specifically, elections have been chronically underfunded. We need more funding. We knew that before the pandemic, and we were gearing up with big funding requests before that happened. And then we got more money in the CARES Act, specifically for COVID-related, pandemic-related election expenses, like having PPE, having bigger spaces, things like that. And for states who needed to ramp up their vote by mail because they didn't have it at the large scale that we do it in Arizona. And so funding is critical, and part of that funding needs to be dedicated for public education. And then when that funding gets to Arizona, we always end up having fights with our legislature because they politicize it. And those funds in Arizona require legislative appropriation. And if the legislature is out of session, we don't get that money. And so it's, so funding is critical. And we're still underfunding elections. And election officials have really risen to the occasion. And done more with less. And so, we've kind of like created our own monster there, but funding is important. And then just the issue around threats and the resources to really address the threats against election officials, because it's hurting our election offices. It's hurting our staff. We're having a lot of turnover in Arizona and across the country. And that's in and of itself is a threat to future elections. But the federal response to those threats is really critical.
Great. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking your time today. I know you have a big, important office to run and a campaign to run. So thank you for spending some time with us this morning, and we will let you go get on with your work. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we're going to start now by turning to our panel of experts who have been studying these issues for quite some time. The first person I'd like to hear from is Edgardo Cortez. He is an advisor to the election security team at the Brennan Center, where he consults on the development of regulation, legislation, and litigation. He's got more than 15 years of experience in all facets of the electoral process, including campaigns, nonpartisan voter registration, federal and state election policy, and local and state election administration. Cortez was Virginia's first commissioner of election, where he spearheaded voter registration and election administration modernizing efforts in the Commonwealths. They included establishing paperless voter registration at DMV locations, fully integrating online DMV transactions with the online voter registration system, establishing an online paperless absentee ballot request system, implementing an easier to use voter registration form, and creating an online assessment of election administration at the local level, making election data more accessible to the public. So Edgardo is just incredibly well-versed in how states run elections, and at the Brennan Center, he has been doing even more of this. And I think I'll go to Edgardo and then turn to Gabe Sanchez. So Edgardo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks for having me with you today. I have had the opportunity over my career to kind of see elections in different aspects, right? I administered at the local level, and then I was, you talked about my time at the state level as the chief election official in Virginia. And so what I'm hoping to do over the next few minutes is kind of weave together, and thanks to Secretary Hobbs for her great presentation and discussion, and kind of piece together some of that, and she focused a lot on Arizona and kind of how that's playing out across the country. All right, so looking at this from an election official standpoint, there's broad agreement amongst election officials, right, that all these lies about the election process have had a real significant impact on their ability to do their job. All right, so the Brennan Center conducted a nationwide survey of local election officials a little bit earlier this year. And nearly 2/3 of officials said that the spread of false information about election officials or about elections has made their jobs as an election official more dangerous. And so we have seen that you talked kind of about the disinformation, the things that it's done to impact voters, but if you look at it, it also has fueled a wave of threats, harassment, and intimidation directed toward election workers. All right, so in our survey, in the Brennan Center survey, 1 in 6 election officials said they've experienced threats because of their job. And 77% said these threats have increased in recent years. And so, and think about this one, the more than 1 in 4 election officials are concerned about being assaulted on the job. And over half of them are concerned about the safety of their colleagues. So you think about local election officials and the work that they carry out, over 1/4 of them are one of their big concerns, based on everything that's been going on, is that they'll be assaulted while on the job. All right, and so these challenges created particularly around election disinformation, around this denial of what actually happens in elections and what happened in 2020, is making it more difficult for election officers to find the help they need. So, in the long term, 60% of the officials we surveyed are concerned that these threats, harassment, intimidation is going to make it difficult to retain and recruit election workers, right? And those election workers are critical in making the process work on election day. All those volunteers, all those poll workers that you see on election day and throughout that process, we can't recruit them. That's going to really slow up and have a huge impact on our elections. All right, and so then we get into kind of the issue that Secretary Hobbs touched on at the very end, which is election officials themselves are leaving the profession. Right, and so we found that nearly 20% of election officials are planning to leave their positions prior to the 2024 election, and so that is a huge right. That's going to have a huge number, and the number one reason that people cited for leaving was these political attacks on the election system, right? On the concepts of free and fair elections. And so as people are departing, they're taking years and decades of experience and expertise with them. So we're looking at a potential, very long-term significant impact across the board on administering elections. And so, we're going to kind of be left bearing this burden. And so as we look at kind of that impact on election officials and what role disinformation has had there, the other thing I want to touch on is Brennan Center also, amongst the many projects that the Brennan Center does, tracks legislation that's going on in the states, particularly around voting issues. And so, since the 2020 election, voting legislation has really taken on, at the state level, has really taken on a new importance. You mentioned kind of the push for federal legislation, which has unfortunately stalled. And so what we have seen since 2020, and what the Brennan Center's analysis has found, is that the overwhelming majority of restrictive voting and election subversion bills that were introduced in 2021, for instance, were related to conspiracy theories related to the 2020 election. Right. And so you have this, so to kind of start putting this together, you have all this election disinformation that goes on in 2020. It's now impacting how election officials do their job, but it's also being used as a pretext to push legislation that's going to make it more difficult for voters to participate as well. All right. And so this year, lawmakers pursued a lot of legislation around the country that would allow for more partisan interference with the election process. Right, including bills that would create processes that overturn election results, and so that criminalize election officials, that require these. Secretary Hobbs referred to the one in Arizona as the fraud it, but they really, that try to require these really, these just not worthwhile reviews that really aren't based on anything, aren't looking at the actual election, but are just kind of these partisan reviews of what's going on for not only past elections, but moving forward. And so, all of this together is harming, the election administration process, but also the voters' faith in the process. So we look at, kind of overall, and I'll wrap up here, but 6 states this year have managed to enact 9 big election interference laws so far this year. There were 148 what we would consider election interference bills introduced in 27 states. Right, and then we've had 2 states that have passed very restrictive, more restrictive access to the vote, but we've had in 39 state legislatures almost 400 restrictive voting bills proposed this year. So again, a lot of this premised on the things, the false disinformation around 2020, things related to drop boxes, absentee voting, all of those things where, where the claims have been disproven, yet they're being used to really restrict access to the ballot box for voters, not only this year, but going forward in the lead up to 2024. So that's kind of, taking the information that the Secretary gave us about Arizona and looking at, it's not just Arizona this is going on, all right? It's going on across the board, and it's really having a negative impact on our democracy and on our ability to kind of run free and fair elections.
Edgardo, let me drill down on two things before we call on Gabe, because that's a perfect segue, the impact on democracy, to what Gabe's going to talk about. What states do you think have seen the most serious threats to election integrity? I know we spoke about Arizona. How would you rank the states in the seriousness of what's going on?
Well, I think certainly Arizona, and a lot of what's going on in Arizona is very concerning. I think we've had a lot of concerning legislation and legislative proposals in places like Georgia, for instance, and a lot of it's really hard to rank where it's most concerning, because I think it's concerning across the board wherever there's an attempt to especially insert partisan interference into the process. Things like changing who's responsible for doing certain things in election administration. I mean, Arizona is one of those states, but Georgia also, where they're they didn't like how 2020 turned out. They don't like what's been going on, and so they're just moving power and decision making and some of those things, or attempting to move those things to more partisan actors, people that don't have, that may not have the same willingness to push back as election officials have done in those states previously. So I think it's hard to rank, but definitely Arizona and Georgia and those states have had some very concerning legislative pushes this past year and last year.
And it's interesting. Arizona and Georgia are also two states that are in the midst of a political transition from being solidly red states to competitive states, and so there's a real struggle for power and a tendency not to believe that this is happening in your state. Georgia, it's that incredible increase in the Atlanta metro area. Arizona, the big increase in coming of age of the Hispanic population. These states do change their electoral composition from time to time. When I was in undergraduate school, Vermont was a rock rib Republican state, and now it has a Democratic Socialist senator. So states change. But I think this is another aspect where people are prone to believe in all of this conspiracy. Let me turn to Gabe, because I want to ask Gabe about the impact on democracy. Gabriel Sanchez is a colleague of mine at Brookings. He's the David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies here at the Brookings Institution. And he also serves as professor of political science and the founding Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Endowed Chair in Health Policy at the University of New Mexico. He is also a director of the University of New Mexico Center for Social Policy, a founding member of the UNM Native American Budget and Policy Institute, and a principal at Latino Decisions, the nation's leading survey firm focused on the Latino electorate. A leading expert on Latino and New Mexico politics and policy, he regularly provides commentary to several state, national, and international media outlets, and he's a nationally recognized expert in survey research and the utilization of rigorous research to inform public policy decisions at the federal, state, and local levels. So, Gabe, you've done some great work on how all of this is impacting the broader question of democracy. I want to draw people's attention to the fact that if it's not up already, it will be up momentarily on the Brookings website, a blog post from Gabe on some of these issues that they might want to have a look at. And Gabe, the floor is yours. What's happening to the public because of these controversies?
I appreciate that. Thank you, Elaine, for the warm introduction and for including me in this panel. I'm very happy to be part of the important discussion and look forward to engaging with you and my other colleagues here at Brookings to find solutions to some of the challenges we'll be discussing today. As you noted, I've been tracking attitudes towards democracy over the course of the past 2 years, and it allows me to shed some light on how the public feels about the integrity of our voting system to add that really important perspective to our discussion today. I'll summarize some of the work that Elaine notes will be up on the Brookings post sometime today, so folks don't feel like you've got to scramble down and catch some of these percentages that I'm going to throw at you. You can grab them in the blog post. But the long story short is, unfortunately, there's been consistent findings across all reputable national polls and surveys that strongly suggest that American democracy is really in serious trouble right now. And one of the troubling trends in the data is the lack of confidence that, unfortunately, a large segment of the voting population has in our voting system. Give you a few examples. An ABC News Washington Post survey recently found that only 20%, so 1 in 5 of Americans feel very confident in the integrity of the US election system right now. Furthermore, and just as troubling, a majority of 56% of respondents to a recent CNN poll said that they have little or no confidence that elections in this country represent the will of the people, right? So troubling data. For me, even more problematic is the pessimistic view of our democratic system that's shared by our nation's youth as well. Very well-known Harvard Youth poll, for example, found that 42% of their respondents believe that their vote does not make any difference in important outcomes, right? So at the end of the day, right, we know, unfortunately, the public has serious concerns about the state of democracy. As we heard from Secretary Hobbs earlier, one of the drivers of decreased confidence in the political system has really been the explosion of misinformation deliberately aimed at disrupting the democratic process. This confuses and often overwhelms voters. And unfortunately, when we look at the data, we see that it's had a marked impact on the attitudes of Americans. I'll reference the collaborative multiracial political study. It's an academic study I've been involved with over the years. And I like this one because it's got large, robust sample sizes, specifically of confirmed voters, and it's got a diverse population, so we can look at differences across race. And so consistent with what we've heard a lot from other polls, this study reveals that a robust 57% of white Americans, and again, remember, these are confirmed voters, believe that there was voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election, including 1 in 4 of those white voters who believe there was definitely fraud in 2020. But this academic survey also helps us understand that racial and ethnic minorities are also highly susceptible to misinformation regarding voter fraud. Almost 40% of Latinos in that sample, and just over 30% of African Americans in the survey think that there might have been at least some fraud in 2020. So this myth, unfortunately, that's often perpetuated that only white Americans or Trump supporters or Trump voters believe that there was fraud in 2020 is just not accurate, unfortunately, when we look at the data. We're also finding in our team surveys, specifically of Latinos, and I reference Latinos because the context of this discussion was in Arizona, where obviously the Latino electorate has been a big part of the discussion of the shift of that state politically and demographically. So when we look at the Latino population, we unfortunately see across a lot of different state samples that a large segment of the Latino electorate believes that there will be significant efforts to confuse and intimidate specifically Latino voters with misinformation and other tactics in the upcoming November elections. For example, just throwing you one reference point from a statewide sample of Latinos in Colorado I recently conducted. Just over 75% of Latinos in the state of Colorado believe that false information is already being spread to confuse Latino voters, and that not enough is being done to help address this information either nationally or in their own backyard in their own state. And finally, we've heard, I think from Mr. Cortez recently, that there's been an unfortunate reality of threats of violence directed towards election officials. And this is unfortunately only part of the concern I have about voter suppression through specifically violence in the upcoming election cycle. In fact, we have found high percentages of Latinos across several states that we're polling in believe that Latino voters may be kept away from the polls through intimidation and violence. And we saw a lot of this in 2020, right? With unfortunately maybe 1 or 2 real examples being overblown with misinformation and a lot of efforts to try to make people scared about exercising their right to vote. And, my team in 2020 did a lot of polling looking at potential solutions to that challenge. And unfortunately, some of the most common solutions present unintended challenges. For example, a lot of people have reached out to me. I've actually seen some questions already from folks on this panel that reference, what about putting police officers in voting precincts to help ensure public safety? But unfortunately, this can generate fear and concern, particularly for diverse communities, immigrant populations, et cetera, who have unfortunately lived through a very checkered history in this country of the use of police and immigration officials at voting places specifically to suppress their vote. So even things that we think of are commonsensical approaches to address this don't often work, unfortunately, because some of this context that we have in this country. So in closing, I guess the multi-million-dollar question is, what can be done, if anything, to help address this challenge? And fortunately, we are seeing some great things happen across the states, with secretaries of state's offices attempting to come up with innovative approaches to help improve the situation. As Elaine noted, secretaries of states are really at the forefront of the battle to try to protect democracy in their borders. For example, Connecticut has invested a substantial amount of money. We're talking millions, I think $2 million in a marketing campaign to share factual information about voting. And they actually have a full salary staff person whose sole focus is to exclusively combat misinformation by trying to root out early misinformation narratives before they go viral and really pose a significant problem. Right. In my own backyard here in New Mexico, our Secretary of State has developed a website that provides real-time fact checks regarding misinformation issues specific to elections in our state. A tool, unfortunately, that I know our Secretary Toulouse Oliver has told me was created in direct response to growing concerns her office has about misinformation, and folks that have paid attention to what's going on with Otero County in our state, very similar to what we heard in the context of Arizona. So unfortunately, right, these tools need to be put into play quickly because of the challenge. Colorado has hired 3 cybersecurity experts to monitor sites for misinformation that is tasked with looking for misinformation about elections, whether it's absentee ballots, voting procedures, where polling locations are going to be held, you name it, right? They're trying to get folks that are savvy about the IT side of this and also the voting integrity stuff, so that hopefully you can have a jointed effort to try to combat a lot of this that's being done digitally. There have been really a lot of these other creative approaches across states that I think can be replicated with relative ease and without a ton of money. And I think having a coordinated effort with states really trying to build toward a quote unquote national myth buster or fact checker system, I think could really go a long way. And finally, right, we're seeing a lot of positive things that are more long-term focused, really aimed at the next generation of voters. And we're talking about middle school and high school students that are really being put through more media literacy programs at their levels to try to help them become, I guess one way to put it is, more informed consumers of information, right? And we know that's so important because these folks, right, are like sponges soaking up all this digital information. So I think states that are working with their public schools in their state to develop curriculums to try to address this issue now before these folks hit 18 and become eligible voters are also things that we can look at. So hopefully, right, we've focused a lot on the challenge. I know it seems overwhelming and daunting, but hopefully some of these approaches states are doing can give folks some ideas of how we might work together to combat these issues.
That's great, Gabrielle. And I'm going to go right to some questions that have come in from the viewers, because some of them are things that I think I would have asked anyway. One of them is a simple question, and I'd like to throw it out to both of you, maybe starting with Edgardo, which is, what can activists do in addition to, say, becoming poll workers? What can activists do on this problem of election integrity? I mean, I think the states are doing, there's wonderful things. I learned a lot from this panel about the things that the states are doing, like Colorado hiring cybersecurity experts. But what can an ordinary citizen do in this?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. That's a great question. I mean, so the question kind of includes being a poll worker. That's certainly important. I mean, I think that's a very big gap that we have in elections, is that everybody's looking for poll workers and folks to help actually run the system that are going to do what they're supposed to and not do what partisan actors want them to do. So I think that's an important piece. I think in addition to that, I mean, I think getting involved, right, there's a lot of the decisions around access, around like polling place locations, number of polling places, all those things happen at the very local level. Right. But, so like attending local electoral board meetings, right? Local election boards make a lot of these decisions, and they're making those decisions now, right? But by the time the
Right.
election rolls around, they've already decided where the polling places are, what all those things are, right? So being involved at that local level and making a presence and speaking up for especially communities that are lacking in resources, making sure that the resources are appropriately spread. You know, when you're talking about I talked a lot about a lot of the negative legislation being promoted. There are a lot of good proposals out there also. Unfortunately, not as many gaining traction in the particular states that are having issues. But right, talking to legislators, doing those things to either push back against bills that are premised on these falsehoods and on these lies around 2020, and promoting things that are going to open up access. So I think there's kind of a broad range of things that people can do to get involved. But I think at that local level, we're seeing a lot of those local election officials in particular get pressure from people wanting them to do the wrong thing. And so knowing that there's other people in the community speaking up and pushing for them to be fair and administer a free and fair election, I think will go a long way heading into this cycle.
That's great. I hadn't even really thought. I mean, this is so local in America. I mean, and as Secretary Hobbs pointed out, there's good things and bad things about it. And one of the good things is people can have an impact. You know, people really can. Gabe, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to hit on a number of points. So I'll just name a few that weren't mentioned. I mean, all politics is local, right? And fortunately for us, when we look at the survey data and we ask people, where do you go to get information that you trust, or who do you trust when it comes to information about politics and policy? Primarily because of a lot of lack of trust in our elected officials, actual individuals from their community, local community organizations that operate in their community are some of the most trusted messengers. So folks out there, local activists, folks that are involved in local community organizations, right? You all are trusted by the community. So whether it's utilizing your own social media platforms to correct misinformation, to infuse trust in our voting systems. I mean, we saw a lot of positive implications for that during COVID, right? Where folks were just putting out quick podcasts telling people about their experiences. Why don't we utilize the same tools and do that now in the context of voting integrity? Right. So I think one of the best things that people can do, and I know I've been part of these efforts myself, is when you hear information, whether it's at events or whether or not you're just in casual conversation, you hear people talking about things that you say, wait a minute, that's just not accurate. Let's actually talk through that. Just think about the multiplier effect. If you encourage 5 people to actually do some research and correct that narrative, that multiplies. And I think it's that kind of groundswell effort that I think will help us get some traction on this issue.
Yeah, I know. I used that myself, Gabe, with this example I talked to Secretary Hobbs about the paper for the county ballots, how incredibly difficult it would in fact be for Chinese operatives to get in and pour fake ballots into a state. I mean, it's just, I suppose it could be done, but it's very unlikely, and it's kind of pie in the sky stuff, let's face it. As many of these conspiracy theories are. Is there, following up on this line of thinking, is there a role, another question that came in is there a role for universities in this? Edgardo?
I think certainly. I mean, there's a lot of universities kind of playing a role, especially in the kind of research and looking at this issue, right, and really facilitating that. I think there's probably a role too for universities in helping set up ways to kind of push back and fight some of this misinformation and the narratives that are out there, right? So I think it's and that can be in partnership with likely in partnership with local, state, and even federal government around how to push back against these narratives and what's the most effective way, right? Because I think universities have the ability to go out and do this research and kind of come up with ideas and ways to push back and really bolster the limited resources that election officials in particular have in a lot of instances, and help promote positive messages and figure out ways, like Gabe was talking about in their research that they've done, like ways that will connect with voters to really push back against these narratives. I think the final thing I'd say there is, Gabe mentioned the kind of misinformation impacting Latino communities, but I think what we have seen, I think misinformation is a big concern, and there hasn't been as much done in misinformation that's being sent out to communities that speak languages other than English, right? A lot of the focus obviously has been on English language misinformation and pushing back, but you see a lot of efforts at misinformation directed in Spanish at Latino communities, and then at different Asian American communities in their native languages. And so I think that's something there we're not quite as far along in. And so having the expertise of universities to kind of help push back and look at misinformation that's impacting communities in languages other than English, I think would be a huge help.
Yeah, Gabe?
Yeah, I think, for the question at hand, what can universities do? I mean, the only other thing I would note to some really strong points that my colleague made is, as a university professor now going on almost 20 years, the best thing we can do is we've got access to the youth, right? We've got folks in our classes hungry to have these conversations, hungry for information. And so I think the obvious is, right, make sure all of us that are in the classroom take opportunities, regardless of what the subject matter is, to address this point, but also role model how to do that effectively. It's not when somebody raises their hand and says, hey, I've heard this misinformation issue, and it's not shutting them down and treating them like they're not intelligent people. It's reflecting on the fact that, hey, there's probably a good reason why you believe in this. Let's talk about that and then correct the narrative. And I think it's important for young people to see us demonstrate how to go about these deliberations, not in a combative way, but in a productive way. And the other point, aside from the direct question that Mr. Cortez brought up is for language minorities, let's keep in mind, we're talking about, and I fall victim to this myself, often this misinformation issue, as though it just happened in 2020, right? I remember tracking misinformation directed at Latinos and Spanish in Arizona back in 2012. It was just done on actual hard paper, right? Telling Latinos voting day was actually 2 days after the election in Spanish. So we've known about these issues and the problems that they pose well before all this was done digitally. Now, I just think the impact of these tools is much more, pervasive, because with one enter on your keyboard, you're talking about millions of people being impacted. But I think we need to remind ourselves that we've been dealing with these issues for decades, and we've got some solutions. Maybe we need to dust off and try to figure out how to retool for this new digital age that we're trying to combat now.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. When governance studies here at Brookings began looking into these issues, and this was several years ago, I think maybe 2018, maybe even before. We did do a little bit of writing about this, and we went back to dirty tricks prior to the digital age, right? And you're right. I mean, one of the most common one was to send your opponent's voters information about the election and have the wrong day. Just have the wrong day for the election on there, and people got it, and then they missed going to the polls. And this was a great trick, very effective. And of course, it was done on paper. And it was done on paper, so you couldn't even see it. You couldn't see it unless somebody told you. You couldn't see it and correct it quickly, the way you can if you're monitoring, monitoring the internet and the electronics. So it works both ways. It's very cheap to send around misinformation these days, but it's not exactly new. People have been trying it for a long time. There's another question kind of along this same line from one of our live participants, Marina Negroponte, who asks, do you see a role for corporations in the election education space? Can a corporation be an extension of voter education in their respective workforces? Can you see partnerships with companies, and how might you see a partnership with a corporation evolving? It's a tricky, complicated question. Gabe, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think, in short, I think it's a great question, because I think we put a lot of emphasis on what states should do, Secretary of State's offices, public sector folks. But this is such a rampant issue. It's an all hands on deck solution, right? We need every aspect of our sectors, including the private sector, heavily engaged in this. And like right off the top of my head, you think about large employers, right? They control thousands of employees' information, right? If they can put out positive messaging, maybe have events with experts like ourselves come in to speak to their staff. I mean, we're talking about the multi-effect being huge. And we look back to 2020, I remember being involved with some pretty cool initiatives on voter information and outreach on everything from the National Football League, the NBA, all these sports teams. Remember, we're heavily involved, many turning their stadiums into super voting centers. Well, I haven't heard much about that since 2020. What happened to all those great efforts that worked so well? Can we go back to some of those efforts that really worked effectively, encourage some of those entities? And I stress professional sports teams because a lot of those folks, that's who particularly young men pay close attention to. They trust information that they hear from those entities. So even if we think creatively and say, okay, what aspects of private sector businesses have traction with what subgroups of the electorate that we need to be worried about, go back to those partnerships that we saw be so effective in 2020. I'm somewhat surprised I haven't seen a lot of that conversation carry over into the upcoming elections and beyond.
Yeah, I haven't either. But on the other hand, midterms are always a little bit less exciting for people to participate in. So maybe we'll see some of that by 2024. Edgardo, what about corporations?
Yeah, thanks, Maya. And thanks, Dave, for all that, because I think you're right. The efforts to kind of partner with and really push people to vote. But Elaine, what you said about like 2022 and the midterms not being, unfortunately, not as many people vote and everything. I think corporation, right, that education piece, carrying that through year in and year out, I think will help promote and make sure that people participate so that their voice is still being heard, not just presidential election years. The only thing I would add to, in terms of partnerships, Gabe talked about a lot about the efforts with voters. I think one of the things we've seen successful in limited scope in the places that have done it, but is providing assistance to election offices in terms of providing a staff to serve as poll workers, right? To take on those jobs, giving employees time off, paid time off, or keeping them on, paying them for the hours that they're spending being a poll worker. And so we have local examples of counties across the country that have partnered with like large local employers, and they've been very successful at getting people to, if they don't have to give up vacation to, limited vacation time that they may have, if they're still getting a day off to be able to provide that public service, and the employer is giving them time off to do that, where we've seen engagement and employees really take on, and people working in some of these large employers and corporations, they may have people that are, savvy with technology and can kind of help with all of the more kind of tech-heavy tasks that election officers and poll workers are having to do now. And so doing partnerships, in addition to kind of the voter education piece, figuring out how to work with election officials in terms of promoting that staff and employees go out and participate as poll workers and take on those roles, but providing them the space to do that through paid time off.
Okay, good. We have two questions on voter IDs. Okay, and one kind of interesting question. The questioner says, why is it considered a disadvantage to require a voter ID? The mere appearance of electoral or malfeasance is the root cause of the problem, a concern that we are currently facing it's the concern we're currently facing in our national and state elections. And somebody else says, what IDs are accepted to verify the person, and how does this vary from state and county? This sounds like it might be a little bit more up your alley, Edgardo, but I'll also go to Gabriel.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And so, when it comes to IDs in terms of voting, I think one of the biggest challenges and obstacles to the way that particularly photo ID laws have been implemented in states across the country the way that it leaves out certain populations that don't have easy access to photo ID. So if you are an individual that drives and that has an ID, has a photo ID, and uses that for all sorts of tasks, you really don't think about the fact that there are communities and there are a lot of individuals out there where it is much more difficult to obtain a photo ID and to use, and they are having to go through and do FAFSA Lite without having access to that. Right, is because they don't have the documents necessary. They don't have the time to be able to, go to DMV for several hours to kind of work through the process. They don't have money to obtain the underlying document. Like, there's a lot of reasons that people don't have access to photo ID, and the problem with making that the kind of end all be all is that it leaves out a group of voters, right, and doesn't provide for them to have the same ability to access the election system, the election process. And so there are other ways to verify identities and to look at, is this the person that we think is here? And the other thing with photo IDs is that it's focused very much on kind of that in-person voting aspect, where number one, we know there's really not any cases where we're looking at, impersonation fraud, which is the basis for this. And so it really doesn't address the issue of voting by mail or kind of absentee vote, early voting, those things. And so we've seen states, for instance, add provisions where you have to send a copy of a photo ID with a ballot, things like that. Well, that's silly. If I'm not there, if you're not the photo ID loses the, any importance in terms of validation if I'm not looking at you. Right. And so in those instances, there's other ways to validate that voter, right? There's information you can ask for that voter has, that it's unique information that only they know and you have access to, that can help validate that it's their vote. So there are other ways to validate identities, to look at, how to get access that doesn't involve requiring people that may not have access to photo IDs to somehow get access to them, right? And so that I think is the kind of difficulty that we've had with particularly photo ID laws. And the question about what's required, it really does vary state by state, right? There are some, like I mentioned, that are very strict photo ID requirements, and that list of photo IDs is very limited. And then there's other states don't require photo ID at all, or have other ways to validate identity. So it really does vary state to state.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this one if I can, Elaine. I've actually been an expert witness with my colleague Matt Boretto at UCLA on a number of photo ID court cases, federal and state level, over the years. So I love the question, because it's one of these very similar to, in my opinion, to putting police at polling locations that on its face sounds like a great idea. But unfortunately, once you look at the data, there's some unintended consequences. So I'll give you just a couple of points on this. And I think it was well stated by my colleague that a lot of it is the devil's in the details in terms of how these laws actually operate. So a case that I worked that probably had the most glaring inequality, both in terms of how the law was written, as well as the implications, was in North Dakota, where I think the question is a good one. What is acceptable ID across the state? In North Dakota, essentially any ID, if I remember correctly, a hunting license, for example, would count. Everything except for a tribal ID. And guess what, right? Who did that disproportionately impact? Native Americans. In fact, when we look, and this is how we do this research, we'll conduct surveys and ask voters, actually take out your ID. Let's go through it. Does it have the following information? Does your name match what's on the voter rolls? Is there an address match to what's on the voter rolls? Because that's really what a lot of these laws require. It's not just a photo ID. All these details have to match what's actually on the photo ID. And guess what? In North Dakota, Native Americans overwhelmingly were less likely to not only have the ID, but the underlying documents that you need to acquire the ID in the first place. When we look at other states, Latinos, African Americans, young voters, let's remember, young people, they don't like to drive, right? We know this. They like public transportation. So many of those folks don't go get a driver's license when they hit 18, the same way my generation all did that valued that. So a lot of these folks just don't have the underlying documents that you need. One scary statistic, I know Dr. Barreto and I did Texas photo ID, which was a big case. We found in our survey, when you extrapolated it, if that law were to hold as it was written, 1.2 million Latino and African American otherwise eligible voters would have been disenfranchised just like that. So on its face, again, photo ID laws sound like a great idea, maybe could infuse some confidence in voters and the integrity of their system. But at the end of the day, it disproportionately impacts a lot of low-income communities, minority communities, and young people. And we know decades of political science academic research has always suggested when you increase the cost associated with voting, in this context, going to track down your birth certificate so you get the required ID, even increasing that cost a little bit decreases turnout, particularly among low resource voters. And so that would be my worry, right? That we do more harm with trying to implement, photo ID across states than the benefits that may come. And there's limited evidence that it actually does increase voter confidence to put them in place in the first place.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a hard question for both of you. Is there a way to deal with both sides of this issue? Is there a way to have, verifiable voters, that this is a real citizen, is registered to vote, et cetera? Is there a way to do that in a way that would increase confidence in the integrity of the election without the discriminatory aspects? Or is this a kind of either or? Can you, is there some solution to this? Edgardo?
Yeah. So, if I can just start, so I think the premise, I think this is where the concern over folks not being as familiar with the election process. So the issue of like identifying who is a voter and if someone's eligible, like there's a lot of work that goes in at election offices when somebody, for instance, registers to vote. Right. So that information is, there's federal law that requires certain checking against Social Security Administration. You have folks that are coming through DMV are getting that process happening at the DMV. So there are a lot of checks going into place to say like, yes, this is a real voter and they're eligible or they're not eligible. Right. And states have a pretty robust system. Again, it varies state to state exactly what they do and what they validate against. But there are processes in place across the board to look at, is this individual an eligible voter? And so then you're really talking about like, all right, we've already validated that you're an eligible voter. And so the question is like, do we need to check you again, essentially, when you go to cast a ballot, right? And so that's where I think the difficulty with the photo ID requirements and everything is this notion that there's nothing going on to check that that people are actually eligible to be, to vote in their respective states. And so I just wanted to point out there are a lot of things that go on at the front end of the process that makes it possible for election officials to know that these are their eligible registered voters.
Gabe?
Yeah, I'll say that I've always been on record on this, that I don't have any underlying, anti-voter ID sentiments. I've always said if we could find an approach that works for everybody and just does not disproportionately impact or overly burden one segment of society, I would support it. I have not seen that. And I've looked extensively at legislation, a lot of which that did not pass, but look closely to see, as Edgardo noted, some of these have a fail-safe, at least in theory, right, for mail-in votes where you mail in a picture of an ID. There's a lot of interesting things, but at the end of the day, what always troubles me is this puts an awful lot of stress on a volunteer precinct worker to look at a picture. Is that Gabe? He doesn't have the typical beard he usually wears. Is that so-and-so? Their last name doesn't look like it matches the voter rolls. And I've always had a lot of concern with putting a lot of that hugely important consequential decision on volunteers who aren't often signing up for that duty and the consequences associated with that. So I have not seen a solution that would essentially do the good that we think that it will do without posing unintentional harm. I just haven't seen that yet. And I think I want to reinforce that, keep in mind, photo ID laws are really intended only to tackle one specific potential source of voter fraud. And that's people fraudulently saying I'm that person and voting in their place. we know even from the Trump administration's analysis of elections, that doesn't happen very often in the United States, right? There's been over, I don't know, 20 years of federal government research and analysis, a handful of actual documented cases. In almost all those instances, it was not intentional fraud. It was a mistake that was done on the hands of the voter. So it's always one of these, like, let's make sure the problem we think we're trying to solve, right, is actually bigger than the problems that will be generated from a potential solution. And I just think photo ID, we haven't got to a place where we have a silver bullet solution.
That's good. And of course, while you were talking about this, I was going back to, of course, a lot of this is almost a historical hangover from the days of the great big city machines, where in fact they did vote the graveyards and lots of other people. But that was now, more than half a century ago that this was going on in Chicago and New York and Philly and Kansas City and the places where you had big and corrupt machines. And of course, it's harder to do these days. And frankly, we don't have these machines anymore. I mean, I haven't known or seen that kind of operation in a long time, but in certain parts of our political system, particularly, it's as if the daily machine from the mid-century is alive and well, and giving the election to Jack Kennedy and not Richard Nixon. So, it was there, but it's not there, and people are having a hard time realizing it's not there anymore. And let me ask you, as we go into our final couple minutes here, another good question that came in is about, and this changes our conversation a little bit, the Secretary of States who are running on the big lie, and other people running on the big lie. What would you say to voters and to our participants about these secretaries of state's races? How can we get involved? How can, if some of these people get elected, what can we do? Gabe?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most dangerous elements of everything that we've talked about, right? And let's keep in mind, it's not just secretaries of states that are running, really using this as a campaign message of all things, right? To be overseeing the integrity of elections, but you've got members of Congress, and even I've seen local level, county level officials really, to me, pose some of the most significant dangers, because we've seen, unfortunately, across the country, including here in New Mexico, how a county commission can pose a whole lot of problems by just not validating the election outcomes in their county jurisdiction. So I think we need to be worried, not just at the Secretary of State level, but all the way across the board. And, at the end of the day, the only thing that we can do is hope our democratic system works by really educating voters, right, about the dangers of this, the facts about this issue, so that hopefully the voting public makes the wise decision and puts people into places of power and influence that know what they're talking about when it comes to voting integrity. But I think that's a key question, because when you've got folks, right, that make it their job in life to perpetuate this myth, and now they have the power to implement that statewide, that's honestly one of the things that keeps me up at night, because it's one of the biggest things that I think is tough to tackle once we get to the point where they're elected.
Edgardo?
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of Gabe's concern about this, and I think to look back at we did that election official survey, and this is a concern amongst election officials too, right? Like I've talked about the large number of people leaving. Well, there's concern about who's gonna fill those positions going forward, and so our survey found that over half of local election officials are concerned that some of their incoming colleagues are going to believe widespread fraud occurred in 2020, right? And so that's a difficult thing to contend with. But I think that what gives me hope, and Gabe talked about kind of our democratic system playing out. I think we've seen a number of these individuals. They have made it clear they're going to use these positions to have a negative impact on people's ability to vote, and to not be supportive of free and fair elections. Have not been doing great in some of the primary races we've seen so far. So I think that at least gives some hope. I think that that message really isn't, voters across the political spectrum, I think, want, free and fair elections. And so if you have people that are saying like, no, I'm going to, this is how the election is going to turn out because I'm running it, like that doesn't hopefully won't play well with voters. But I think that's, it kind of everything we've talked about in terms of participation and voter education, everything, like to let people know that those are the things that are on the ballot and that people need to show up and participate to ensure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and the only other point is, for those of us that live in states like I'm blessed to, that have great secretaries of state and infrastructure in place doing the right thing. If you live in one of those states, consider getting involved in some of these state races outside of your own jurisdiction that are tight, whether that's donating some money, whether that's getting on the phone banking and being involved, right? I think that's basically what we can all do as individual citizens to try to improve these outcomes.
Yeah, that's great. Let me remind the audience, we only have a couple more minutes, but if you've got a burning question, please send it in. And in the meantime, let me just give you a final question, unless we get another one from the audience, which is, what about criminalizing attacks on election workers? How many states are doing this? Do we need the federal government to do this, or can states take this on their own? Edgardo?
I think there are certainly things that states can do to help this issue. I think in most places, and even under federal laws that we have existing, I think there is room to prosecute individuals that are making these threats against these election officials, like across the country. And so I think, we have things like the Department of Justice setting up a task force to look at these threats and intimidation of poll workers and election officials. I think they have had a couple of people that have been charged so far, in relation to what happened post 2020. But I think, as states look at this issue, and Secretary Hobbs talked about kind of resources, right, providing resources to help election officials deal with these threats. And so there are states looking at things like, aside from the criminalizing the behavior, which I think in a lot of places can be more explicit, but the laws that are on the books allow for prosecution. So I think it's both getting law enforcement to take this seriously and act on it. But then aside from that, in terms of helping election officials, it's, states are looking at creative things like, for instance, allowing election officials to participate in address confidentiality programs, right? Things like that will provide more protection for them that's being used in other facets of our society to help victims of different crimes, expanding those services to help election officials to protect them from things like what Secretary Hobbs talked about, people showing up at her house and making all these threats. So I think there's kind of a twofold approach here, which is, yes, go after the people that are doing the bad things, but let's also look at the resources and help for election officials in terms of keeping them safe.
Oh, that's great. Gabe?
Not much more to add to that. I mean, I think that's consistent with my perception that the tools are in place in terms of state laws already. That's my perception. The laws on the books are there. It's just really a question about resources, right, available to states to be able to police and do something about it. And then at the end of the day, the political will, right, which is often, I suppose, going to fall on attorney general's offices. If they get a live case where there is evidence, right, going all the way through the process, right, and having the political will to think about prosecution. And I think that's really what's necessary, because we all know as Americans, right, until you see somebody actually being prosecuted all the way to the full extent at the end of the rainbow here, it doesn't change behavior. And I think we need more brave souls to say, you know what, we're going to do this all the way through because it's the right thing to do.
Gabe, that reminds me that going back to January 6th, remember that after that, the insurrection, people said that on March 4th, there would be another attack on the Capitol. And the Washington got all protected and fences up and all this stuff around Washington, D.C. And on March 4th, nothing happened. Mm-hmm. And one congressman that I spoke to about this said, well, of course, nothing happened, because in between January 6th and March 4th, people had the FBI showing up at their door saying, you realize that what you did was a crime. And it didn't matter whether President Trump said do it or not, it was a crime. And you're right, watching, if prosecutions happen, it does have a dampening effect, particularly in these sort of politically passionate actions where people think they're doing the right thing until they're not. So listen, it's been great talking to the both of you. Edgardo, we really admire the work of the Brennan Center. I hope those listening will pay attention to your tracking of this work here. Gabe, have everybody listening have a look at Gabe's blog post, which should be up this morning, and follow Gabe's research on public opinion and these issues, which is very insightful. And thank you all very much.